So we started off by naming a country in the chat for the bell ringer, and then the journal, 3 to 5 sentences. You should have addressed the prompt, what do you know about Europe after World War II? So if you haven't submitted that already, please do so. And then, of course, the notes. And as I just pointed out, hopefully you clicked on the Unit 3 notes and opened up the correct file. And in that file, you can, of course, type in the pertinent information, including your name, the date. Today is the 16th, and this is unit number 3. And the topic, you can just type in Europe for that. And so your different notes don't get all mixed up. It might be a good time to also change the name. You can put Unit 3, for instance. That way you don't have a bunch of documents named Notes Google Docs. So today we'll look at the Cold War. We'll talk more. There's actually a unit just about the Cold War, but we'll look at it, how it began in Europe from particularly the European perspective. And so that's one of the 3 major topics we'll look at here in this unit. And so what agreement set up the Cold War and how? Well, the first couple ones would be known as the Atlantic Charter and Tehran. And these are both named after the places where they occurred. And if you'll note in the picture, the 2 people in the middle are the 2 significant figures that will help contribute to the beginning of the Cold War. And that would be in the middle there, the shorter guy would be Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or Britain as we call it. And the guy who appears taller, because at this time he's probably wearing leg braces and is propped up by a cane, would be FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the first part of that, the Atlantic Charter, obviously they met in the Atlantic Ocean on a ship. And even though it would occur in 1941, 4 years before the end of World War II, FDR and Churchill were already thinking about what the world would look like after the war. And so they agreed that empires would be declining. So the old imperial system of colonies and all that would decline. So empires would decline or weaken or go away. They also agreed that there should be more trade. Countries should trade more with each other, because if they're trading with each other, they won't fight each other as much. They agreed that people should be free from want and fear. They should be free from want and fear. However, kind of causing the Cold War would be the fact that the other person that should have been in this picture was not included, and that would be Joseph Stalin. Remember, at the beginning of World War II and throughout it, we were allies, the three of us, but in this Atlantic Charter, it just seemed like they were only making an agreement between the two of them and leaving the Soviets out. And so that automatically made the Soviet Union suspicious. And so when the next meeting happened in Tehran, which is in Iran, they decided to invite Stalin as well. So Stalin was there. And of course, Stalin's biggest complaint was, well, you're busy talking about all these other things that you want to happen, but we still have a war to win. And his biggest gripe was most of the fighting was being done by the Soviets. So he wanted the other two to promise that they would start fighting on the Western Front. Stalin had the Eastern Front, and he said, we're doing too much dying, too much fighting. There needs to be a second front open with Germany. Unfortunately, when FDR and Churchill agreed to this, they also kind of gave permission without even knowing it that Stalin would keep pushing from the east and he would probably end up holding on to that territory. And so that's one of the unfortunate problems here is they didn't insist that Stalin would let countries like Poland be free after World War II, but instead he would take it that he was allowed to keep controlling them. And then there are the last two meetings at Yalta and Potsdam. Once again, these are named after places. The first meeting at Yalta, you can see, would have Churchill, FDR, and Joseph Stalin. They were often called the Big Three. And at this point, it isn't just the democracies suspicious of the communists and vice versa. It was also FDR suspicious of Churchill. FDR was worried that Britain will still want to keep an empire. They also allowed the Soviets to keep islands off East Asia to try to get their help against Japan. So they also agreed that the Soviets would keep islands off the coast of East Asia so that way they would help fight Japan. So in other words, it gave the Soviets even more territory. And one thing they would agree on, all three of them, would be to set up the United Nations. So they would agree to set up the United Nations. The other meeting at Potsdam will be just to kind of tidy up into the war agreements. And you can see there in the middle, FDR has been replaced by Truman. FDR ran for office 4 times and won all 4 times. But unfortunately, in the beginning of his fourth term, he ended up dying. So Truman takes over. There they agreed to give some of the German land back to Poland. So some of the German land will go back to Poland. They also agreed to divide Germany. So they divided Germany. And it was more, we just talk about it, in this class we'll just talk about it as east and west, but it was actually divided up into more sections than that. But we'll just talk about it east versus west. And so next we come up to an organization that will begin. That's not the United Nations. It's not the United Nations. And that would be NATO. So what role did NATO and the Warsaw Pact play? And you could actually answer this with one thing, and it would be the spread of communism, or stopping or causing the spread of communism. NATO was meant to stop the spread of communism. Warsaw was meant to spread communism. So the spread of communism is what both of these organizations are about. One is stopping, one is causing. Does anybody know what we call America and its allies in Europe's effort to stop the spread of communism? Does anybody know what word we use for that? Yeah. Starts with a C. You try to put something in something else and keep it there. Oh, that's close. Containment. So we were practicing a policy of containment. So the United States formed NATO to try to contain or stop communism. And NATO stands for the North, it's up there on the screen, Atlantic Treaty Organization. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So if you think about it on a map, on one side of the North Atlantic is the United States and Canada, and on the other side is Europe. So that's exactly who it was going to involve. Now, how are they going to stop the spread of communism? Well, NATO is mostly a military alliance. A military alliance. And so basically, if the Soviets or any of their communist partners attempted to invade Italy or France or Britain or the United States, then all the other countries would have to help defend them. And apparently it worked because none of them ever were invaded. In fact, the only time we ever used NATO's organizational charter, if you attack one, you attack us all, the only time it was ever used was 9/11, when the United States was attacked, and we used the NATO charter to get all the other countries to help us, especially in Afghanistan. So we actually never ended up having to use it to fight communism directly, not in Europe anyway. And of course, a lot of what happened during the Cold War was kind of a chess game between the two sides. So, of course, the Soviets had to start their own organization. So they started what was known as the Warsaw Pact. And so, what was this? It's basically the opposite of NATO. It's a military alliance to help protect the communist countries. You can see up there on the map, it included the Soviet Union, which includes Russia, but also Eastern European countries, East Germany, Poland, for instance, Czechoslovakia, and so on. So it's a military alliance meant to protect the communist countries. Now, it looks like, oh, that's nice, the Soviets are helping out these Eastern European countries, but really, in reality, the Soviets have just had puppet governments put in all these countries, and so really they were still controlling them. But it looked nice that they have their own borders and they're their own country. And just like NATO, of course, wouldn't be used to fight communism, the Warsaw Pact really was only ever called up to help put down rebellions that occurred inside their own country. So whenever there was any pro-democracy movement, the Warsaw Pact would be used to help stop any type of resistance. So it really wasn't used to stop the United States from invading. It was meant really just to help put down rebellions that would occur. And so that's the way Europe would look from 1945, the end of World War II, the whole way up until the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. It would be a divided continent between the communist countries in red, and the kind of map gets kind of cut off, and the democracies or capitalist countries in gray. And it was very much an us versus them mentality. And we kind of like to just think of it as the United States and the Soviet Union, but us includes all of the gray countries as well. So people in France and Britain and Italy and so on were also worried about communism and nuclear weapons. And they had a lot more to be worried about because they were right next door. The Soviets didn't need to fire an intercontinental ballistic missile to hit Europe. They just needed a plane to take off and fly 30 minutes and drop a nuclear bomb. So Europeans were incredibly worried about nuclear war, but they were also worried about soldiers marching across because the Soviets had one of the biggest armies in the world. And the British, for example, believed that if they tried a normal invasion of troops, they would only be able to hold off the Soviets for 3 days at the most. So that helped define what exactly was going on in Europe at the time. So let's go ahead and stop the notes for now. And you can, of course, put those aside. You won't have to turn the notes in until the end of the week. But back on the regular Canvas screen, you can see the assignment that's titled Country. And when you click on that, the Unit 3 Country, you'll see it says pick one of the following countries, read about it, click Submit, and type 10 facts in your own words, and answer the question in 3 to 5 sentences. How would you describe the country since World War II? And you can see you can choose. These are 4 of the more significant countries in Europe during this time, besides obviously Russia. And that would be Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy. So you can choose any one of those. Just read through it and then click Submit, and the text box will open up and you can type in 10 facts and answer that question in 3 to 5 sentences. If you get done with that by the end of the period, you can also take a look at the maps activity. You don't have to do anything until the end of it, but it asks you to go through, and it goes to the same website we used for maps of the Middle East. And you go through each section and take a quiz until you get 100% for each section of Europe. Northern Europe is the one it starts off with. That's the easiest, and it goes through and they get harder The end of the assignment is, and you don't have to do this today, once you get to all of Europe, you take the quiz as many times as you want, and whenever you're satisfied with your score, you can just take a screenshot of the score and just submit that as your evidence that you participated in that activity. So if you get done with the country assignment, you can go through and try some of the European map quizzes under the USW 3 maps link. Does anybody have any questions? No questions. Okay, so go ahead and look at the country activity. Look at each of those countries. Pick one that you think you might be interested in reading for that assignment.